Hi, welcome back to the Busy Corner. Today I'm going to show you how to knit a cable panel for a cable panel Afghan. So I have one done, and you can see it's a simple cable on a garter stitch background, and it is about 60 inches long when it's laid flat. This is from a pattern for a straight knitting needles, and I made it with, or I'm going to be making it with this CARON 1 pound. So far, and this is one panel, I have used just under a pound of yarn for this piece. It doesn't feel like it when I pick it up, but because of that, this is one of the reasons panel Afghans are so popular. Historically they are, and they remain so. It's kind of like a patchwork quilt. Anybody who was working in Afghan, instead of carrying the whole thing around, if you wanted your knitting to be portable, you could just work a panel at a time. And if you go online, you'll see some very beautiful panel Afghans where some of the panels alternate, or you can alternate the colors across the scheme. I think too it was a way for people to use up a stash of yarn, or if they didn't have enough supplies to begin with, they could make the blanket as they came across the materials, much like a patchwork quilt. So they have a long history, and they're still popular. You can find lots of beautiful patterns online. A lot of the crocheted ones are done in squares and added on and seamed as you finish the pieces, and these are done in strips. Anyway, I tried something this time, and I'm going to caution you not to do this. I rolled my yarn up into 2 big balls, and there's a little over 2 pounds of yarn in this ball, and I have 4 strands. I wanted to try this because I had read different places to do that with your yarn, and I ran into a mess because as you are knitting along, unless you are absolutely perfect, this is what I have left of my first ball after knitting the first panel. As you're knitting along, if you have not wound this perfectly evenly with your tension on your yarn, you're going to find that some of your strands in the ball get longer and longer, and you end up with kind of this tangled mess at the bottom. So by the time I got done with this panel, most of my time was spent combing out my yarn. So I'm sorry I did it this way. I would definitely recommend that you get a Afghan type yarn, and so you can use 1 pounders. But again, I wouldn't recommend putting them into one ball. This was a mess, and I wish I hadn't done it this way. But anyway, I wound up with I was using 4 strands initially for this, and I just didn't think it had enough heft to the stitch. You want to make sure that when you are knitting a cable, that you can actually see the cable, that the fabric is dense enough that even if you spread it out a bit, you can still see that the cable is there. Obviously, these aren't reversible, but that doesn't matter. People just lay them out flat. Now, you could alternate these panels with garter stitch panels, or if you come across another pattern, you just have to make sure that they're the same length. And this pattern originally called for 3 strands of yarn of number 4, and that's what this is. But remember, these yarns aren't all created equal. Lion Brand has a 1 pounder yarn that's also a number 4, but it's substantially finer. And after I read some reviews of it online, I decided to use the CARON. It's not as soft, but it's supposed to be more durable, and I really liked this heathered color. So anyway, the original pattern called for 3 strands and this size knitting needle, which are 17s, US 17s. And in your kit, this is equivalent to the 3/8 inch PEX tubing, which are the white ones with these skinny ones with your attached elbow. So these are the same, basically. They're a couple millimeters off. So I decided to do it on the 1/2 inch Schedule 40 pipe that have these attached elbows with your pre-drilled hole, and I'm using 5 strands of the CARON. And like I say, depending on the brand you use, you might have to use a thicker yarn. But it doesn't matter. The beauty of this pattern is that You could use 2 strands of a very bulky yarn and knit fewer panels. This originally called for 7 panels, and each panel is knit the same way. And the original size was going to be about 48 inches wide and about 58 inches long or so before you put the fringe. You won't have to worry about weaving in your tails because it's going to get fringed, but you are going to have to sew your seams, and that's where you're going to sew it along the bumps of the garter stitch. And consult your knitting book. Some people do it another way, they come over, but I don't think you're going to want to do that because that might make a more stronger seam for a garment. On this it's going to be bulky, so I would stick with your edge bumps and sew it up that way with a mattress stitch. So what I'm going to do is show you the whole cycle of the 8 rows for the cable pattern. And in my description underneath the video, or on the video page, but in the description box, I'm going to write out the pattern as it is for straight needles and for the stationary rods, so that you can compare what I've done, which will help you transpose. You can transpose, any pattern once you understand, what I've done in terms of changing one side of this. So, you'll remember too, if you're doing any pattern from a straight knitting needle, you're going to have to reverse the stitches on one of the pipes. Now, really it doesn't matter if it's the left or the right, but you need to be consistent about what it's going to be. For me, I think it's easier if I always know this is going to be my wrong side. So just as if you were knitting a little piece, like here's an example. If I just show you this real quick. I've developed a fetish for dishcloths. This is the right side of the dishcloth. And when I'm knitting this side, as it is on the needles, which would be here, of course it'd be tiny needles. On one row, I'm knitting the right side. But when I'm done with that, it gets turned over. And essentially, I'm knitting then this side, the wrong side. And that's when I have to reverse my stitches. And this is the purl side of the fabric, the wrong side of the fabric. So you have to create that same thing on the pipes, even though you don't turn it over. Because most patterns are a combination of purl and knit stitches. So, we're going to go through the whole beginning of this pattern and do a whole cycle. So you can see that I've already cast on 16 stitches onto my right pipe, and I'm doing this because I know that I'm going to begin with 2 rows of garter stitch. And those 2 rows of garter stitch will be row 1 as I move from the right to the left pipe, and row 2 will be from the left to the right pipe. That way my cable is going to be on this side. I actually work the cable itself on row 5, and I want to do it from the right side of my piece, not the wrong side, because then I'd have to reverse the stitch, and cables are always worked from the right side of the piece. So that's why I'm here on the right side. And let me turn my chair around here. So this piece begins, per the written instructions, with 2 rows of garter stitch. And so I'm going to begin with a front stitch. This row, make it front stitches or knit stitches, just as you would normally do if you were doing knitting needles. You would almost always put your stockinette or your knit stitches on the front side. Not your stockinette, but your knit stitches. So we'll begin with that. We don't need to click our clicker for this. We're just going to do 2 rows, and this is just a foundation row before we do the cable. So we'll do this whole 16 stitch row as knit stitches or front stitches. Now if your pattern doesn't have you wind back up on this pipe, if you're working any kind of a panel Afghan like this, there's some type of a border at the bottom. You can always add or subtract a row to get you, make sure you have all your strands. You can always add or subtract a row to get you back to with your cable pattern beginning here on your right side. For me, that's easier. So I'm going to just suggest to you that you think of your right pipe as the right side of the fabric. And to me, that's easier to do it that way. The other reason that that makes it simpler is oftentimes I don't rewrite the pattern out. If I'm just sitting there looking at the pattern and looking at the rows, I know that I need to transpose what is usually the even number. It's not always even number. It's always this left pipe. Or you can rewrite it like I did here. And the reason I did that, these are just such short rows that it made more sense for me to write it out. And this is the pattern transposed, not how it was originally. And this was a little faster for me to work it down like this. Okay, so we did that as front stitches. Now we're going to do a row as back stitches, or the purl row. These are purl stitches. And again, if you wind all your yarn into a ball like I did, that is a cautionary tale. I think part of the problem is some of the yarn I was able to get to come out the middle of the skein as this extra skein I'm using to add the 5th strand comes out of the center nicely, but the other ones didn't do that. But the yarn was so heavy I couldn't just keep yanking it off from the outside of the ball. So when you run into those situations, some of that yarn is probably getting stretched as you pull it off the skein. It took me almost 3 hours to wind that yarn, by the way. So to me it makes more sense to never bother. So probably would have worked out better if had the skeins been smaller and lighter. Again, don't go run out and get expensive yarn to do Afghans. Okay, so there's my first two, what we'll call my foundation rows. So now the pattern wants us to begin what is considered the cable section. And you're going to repeat this. It's 8 rows in length. And you're going to repeat this over and over again until the section, the cable section here, is as long as you want it to be. They suggest 57 inches, but you have to end on a row 7. So we're going to set our clicker now for row 1, and this is exactly as the pattern is written. So we knit 2, which is front stitch, and we purl 3, then we knit 6, and we purl 3, and we knit 2. And now we're ready to knit row 2. And row 2, 4, 6, 8, that's all our even numbered rows, is the exact same pattern. And this is the opposite of what the pattern was originally. So the original pattern told me to knit 5, but I'm going to purl 5. So I'm basically treating this row as the wrong side of the fabric. You won't have to do this if you're knitting a pattern from a circular pattern meant to be knit in the round. You always have to check that. Make sure it's not, if it's 4 circular needles, make sure they're not being used as straight needles. Now we knit 6, which is the opposite of what the pattern had told me. Like I say, I actually rewrote this out this way this time. I don't normally do that. But I wanted to show you that's one way so that if you don't want to get confused, You can always rewrite it, but just know you did it that way. Some patterns are so complicated and the details so lengthy that it seems a pain to write out the whole thing, and you can make a mistake as you're doing that. So it's better just to reverse it in your head as you're going along sometimes. And that completes row 2 with the last 5 purl stitches. Now we're going to do row 3. This was exactly as the original pattern. So we knit 2. See, I'm already having trouble with my yarn here, where one of these strands was a little bit looser when it got rolled up. And I spent more time messing with my yarn than I did knitting. So I said, I will never do this again. However, if you're doing those big pounders, it does create a dilemma. You almost have to wind it first. And now we knit 6. And again, if you lose count, just look down at the side of your work. And you'll see those bumps along the side for those on the outside when you've knit the stitch. Now we purl 3. So this was exactly as the pattern wrote it out. Alright, now we knit row 4. And again, this is we'll call this the wrong-sided row, is a good way to think of this. And the pattern told me to knit 5, but I'm going to purl 5. Now I knit 6. And now I purl 5. The original pattern says to knit 5, but I'm going to purl 5. Like I say, I'm going to write it out both ways in my description. Okay, now we're ready to do our cable row. This is row 5. So the first thing we do is knit 2. Then we purl 3. Now we slip 3 to our cable needle. So I made this yesterday. I like this better. This is a piece of tubing with a stick in it. So rather than a pencil, the pencil was too slippery, but it was the right length. So there's our 3 stitches on our cable needle, and we're just going to tuck this under a few strands of our knitting so it stays up there and our stitches don't fall off. And we're going to knit 3 now from our pipe. So there's our 3 knit from the pipe. Now we can knit the 3 from our cable needle. So just slide this over a bit, take your first stitch and make sure you have all the strands. Bring it forward, knit it. You can see why, when you're working a cable, for example, why your cable needs to be worked on the right side of your work. Otherwise you'd have to purl these. So that gets into some messes, so it's easier to have a rule of thumb where all your cables and so forth are worked on the right side of your work. There's the second one, and now the third one. You just slip this all the way out now. Make sure you don't drop your stitch, and bring it forward, and you can kind of see, you should see it coming off, and that the stockinette stitches are right below there when you knit it. If you don't see that, you've twisted the stitch, and you need to go back. That's why you want to make sure that you don't drop that and accidentally twist it. Now you purl 3, and knit 2. And that completes row 5. Click your clicker. Now we're going to do row 6. Now I'm going to do the opposite of what the pattern said. So I'm going to purl 5. And now I'm going to knit 6. This part of the pattern is what's giving me the garter stitch background. And now I'm going to purl 5 again. Okay, see what's happened to my yarn. It's goofed up already. So now I've got to try to comb out these. You want to make sure that these are hanging side by side. It doesn't matter if they twist, as long as it's twisted evenly. And but you don't want it one kind of hung up on the other like that. All right, row 7. We knit 2. This is exactly, exactly as the pattern has it written. Now we purl 3. Knit 6. Now we're going to purl 3. And last we knit 2. If we were ending this panel, this would be the row we end the panel on. But of course we're not. Now we do row 8, and this is the last row in the cable pattern, and we purl 5. So again, this is the opposite of what the pattern told us to do, as we are creating our wrong side by doing this. And this is the easiest way, I think, to transpose patterns. And if you have to keep stopping and mess with your yarn, that's where you lose count. So I found that very distracting. If I ever wind up big balls like that again, I'll make sure I'm only balling up the ones I've pulled from the center in one ball and the ones I have to unspool in another. And maybe that would have helped that. Okay, now I do my purl 5. Or maybe I'm just an idiot, I don't know. But I really tried. I had a feeling that that might be the conundrum if I did that with the yarn. Okay, 2 more. And again, you are going to, let me show this piece now. So that's what we've got so far. As you can see, we have 1 twist to our cable done. And when you get done with this, if you've lost count, it's a good idea if you want to keep 2 clickers so that you're counting rows. But if you lose track, it doesn't really matter, because here's what you're going to do. you know that every time you see this cross, this was the center of, I should have pulled this a little tighter. See, that's got a little bit of a boof there. I didn't pull that tight enough when I went back, so I'll probably undo that. I'm kind of sitting in an odd position here, but you won't see that on the other ones. But the point being, as you go along here, each of these crosses, every time you made this cross, where they come cross over, that was a row 5, a row 5. So if you lose count in your piece and say, oh gosh, I don't know how many rows I put on, the first thing you could look at is your bumps. Each row of garter stitch is equal to 2 rows of knitting. So if you were on this size pipe, it's very easy to count your rows by just 2, 4, 6, 8, so on and so forth. Or you can go back to your beginning and say, I know that was a row 5. So this was 8 rows of stitching with 2 rows of garter stitch. And I did that 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. So I know that I knit for my panel here 14 times. I knit that cable section that I just showed you of 8 rows. And again, you see this little loose place here. It's because I didn't, after I worked the cable, I didn't pull that tight enough. You want to make sure that you pull that tightly when you restart your, you do those next purl stitches. You want to close that gap up. That's what creates holes in knitting. I didn't pull that tight enough. You can see that, those holes aren't here on this other piece. And they shouldn't be. You should pull it tight enough that those gaps are closed. So, anyway, my piece then, I did 14, and everybody's going to be different, and maybe you'll just choose a different type of yarn and a different size pipe. You want to get to roughly 57 inches or so, but you want to be able to go all the way through. You end at a row 7. Then you do 2 more rows of garter stitch, just like you did at the beginning, and then all you have to do is, you'll want to knot that through once, but you'll leave that as part of your fringe. And then do enough panels, depending on what kind of yarn you have, or how many pipes. This amount of yarn, I have 5 pounds of yarn, but the length is what's critical. And I'll have enough yarn to knit 4 panels. Traditionally, there's also something, after you've sewn all the panels together, traditionally you do a border. It might be garter stitch or something like that, and you can always add that later. And you'll see online, there's many, many examples of panel afghans. So that's today's lesson. Thanks for watching.